Back during the rounds of pre-release interviews for Netflix's live-action Avatar show, a lot was made of a curious decision the showrunners had made to tone down or otherwise remove Sokka's sexism from the character and story. In the first few episodes of the original cartoon, Sokka was obnoxiously sexist, and a major arc of his throughout the first season is his maturation, learning empathy, humility, and respect. Sokka was always a hero, right from the get-go. When the chips were down, he always did the right thing. But he had flaws. He was impatient, he was arrogant, he was somehow simultaneously overly serious and inappropriately jokey. And throughout its 3 seasons, all of these sharp edges are sanded down, resulting in the more rounded, balanced Sokka we see at the end of Book 3. That was what made him a great relatable character. He wasn't defined by his sexism, he was defined by his strength of character in overcoming it and admitting he was wrong. While the outcry at the time was fierce, little did anyone know that this wasn't an isolated incident. It's a systemic problem in the live-action show, of pushing all the characters closer to a middle grey personality, whether in adding a bit of edge to previously actualized mentors, or softening the extremes of the protagonists and antagonists. In the process of adapting from 2D animation to 3D live action, somehow everything had come out the other end flatter. When critically analysing a piece of work, it can be both a blessing and a curse when it's an adaptation. The first problem to overcome is human psychology. We have an inherent bias towards certain pieces of information on a subject, and consider all other pieces of information in relation to that one thing. It's called the anchoring effect, and oftentimes it's completely arbitrary which particular thing your brain chose to anchor to. Well, not arbitrary. Often it's the first or last thing you're exposed to. Rather, it's not based on any inherent value. This can make judging something like an adaptation particularly difficult if you're trying to approach things in an analytical way. True objectivity is impossible, paradoxical, and not even desirable when it comes to looking at fiction. Stories exist to affect us in some way. Viewing them through the lens of a dispassionate robot would be missing the point. You should embrace the fact that something made you feel a certain way and get to the work of trying to understand why in ever-increasing depth. The trouble is that inherent bias towards the original of a work is yet another layer of subjectivity you have to factor in and potentially overcome while analysing. It's even worse if you have other forms of attachment to the original. Like many people, I grew up watching the Avatar cartoon. I remember coming home from school and watching episodes way too close to the TV. I specifically remember watching the Blue Spirit episode for the first time on a cozy Saturday morning. I remember the immense feeling of catharsis from the show's finale, partly because it was only behind the Lord of the Rings in giving me that feeling, and partly because I never expected to get that feeling from a fucking Nickelodeon cartoon. I remember falling in love for the first time in my teens because of Avatar. I surprised a girl by recognizing her phone background was Aang in the Avatar state, and she ended up being my first real kiss. To say that Avatar is a core pillar of my childhood would be a fucking understatement, and all of that is clouding my judgment of the Netflix show. Honest, self-aware, rational criticism of an adaptation you have feelings of attachment towards is extremely difficult. Frankly, I don't think that I'll achieve it here, but I also wouldn't expect it of anyone else. After all, we've been burned before. Just through simple pattern recognition, the term adaptation or based on the hit so-and-so is, if not a red flag, at least a dark orange. It's still a sticking point if you pretend to be objective and try to just focus on the work itself. On the one hand, differences between the two are more obvious, so you can easily highlight the reasons why you liked one work more than the other. More neutrally, the very fact that there are differences can sometimes help you understand authorial intent and at least appreciate what they were trying to do. They changed it for a reason, presumably, and a great number of changes can add up to a clear vision of what they were going for. But on the other hand, the obviousness of some changes can lead you to misidentifying the actual cause in your change of feelings. Yeah, Sokka isn't goofy and his name is pronounced Sokka, but that has a great deal less of an impact than removing the sights of all of his character growth from the story. When I was a kid, I loved the Aragon books to a probably unreasonable degree. It was the plot of Star Wars with dragons. I had no defenses against it. There's a couple of surface level details about the character Arya that come up over and over again in Aragon's narration, that being her jet black hair and the scent of pine needles that surrounds her. She's Yennefer coded, is what I'm saying. So when the movie version came out in 2006, I was furious. We have no idea whether she smelled like pine needles, and admittedly it would be wild if Ed Spielers goes up to her like, "Is that fine. But one thing was very obvious. That motherfucker has red hair. It occupied all my thought for the rest of the film. I couldn't even enjoy the parts that were close to enjoyable. I knew consciously that it was a terrible film in many other regards, but all I could say when the movie ended and my parents asked me why I didn't like it was Arya's hair wasn't black. Now, by no means is it a mark of a good adaptation to merely replicate the surface details of the original. Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio doesn't even remotely resemble the image of Pinocchio we've become familiar with in the past 140 years of Pinocchio media, but it's arguably the best version of the story ever told, better than the original and better than the Disney version, which most people hold up as the gold standard. But the creators of the Aragon film weren't trying to tell a new story using the framework of the book. They were trying to cash in on a popular fantasy novel by making an equivalent movie version of it. I didn't have the words back then, at the tender and mild age of 11, to adequately describe what bothered me so much about it. And even now it seems so silly to try and justify it. After all, it's such a small thing, a drop in the ocean of much more affecting problems with the film. The color of a character's hair is so insignificant that she could have any color at all, and that was the problem. It would have been so easy to make her hair black. They could have dyed it. They could have used a wig. They could have cast a naturally black-haired actor. But instead, they just left it ginger. But listen, their hair color didn't really matter. I mean, it definitely does make a difference. We have ingrained preconceptions about people's appearance, mostly learned behavior. Like it or not, you will have immediate unconscious reactions to people's appearance that you cannot control. Sometimes that'll be useful, like how storytellers can use this coding to convey character via surface-level appearance. And sometimes that'll be distinctly not useful, and something you have to actively fight, like the idea that blondes aren't as smart, or racism. But for the purposes of effectively telling the story of Aragon, Arya's hair color wasn't the problem itself. It was just the smoking gun, the symbol of my frustration at a character being dismantled and poorly put back together, with pieces missing and barely resembling the original it was supposed to be imitating. It was more of a warning sign that if that aspect of the character didn't matter, then what else was considered disposable? It's the question the director of every Superman film, past and future, faces. Do we put him in the dumb fucking strongman underwear outside his clothes? It can lead to a bit of a domino effect. If you think that he's better without his briefs, do you also think he's better without his careful avoidance of unnecessary damage? If you think he's better without the carefulness, do you also think he's better without his unshakable optimism? And if you think he's better without that, do you even want to make a Superman film, Zack? Sure enough, the Arya I knew, the stern, cold, practical, solitary warrior from the books, was replaced with this sweet, sensitive, vulnerable Aragon superfan. And the movie was bad. The acting was stilted, the dialogue was dull and cliched, the action was underwhelming. What I was saying when I was so annoyed by Arya's hair was, they didn't care enough about the thing I love to do it justice. She could have had black hair and 3 different lines commenting on how she smelt like a car freshener, and she still wouldn't have been Arya. And this is how you end up with the trailer for the live-action Avatar show, and the majority of hopeful praise directed at it. Everyone and everything looked spot on. The costumes, the hair and makeup, the environments. It was basically a one-to-one recreation of the cartoon. Some specific shots were even directly lifted from the cartoon. What better sign could you have that this would be a faithful adaptation merely converted into live action? Well, it turns out that in the same way that seeing a detail missed out can often be a signifier of a lack of care for the source material, when an adaptation so slavishly pays attention to these surface-level details, that can give the outward appearance of authenticity, without any guarantee of substance underneath the hood. The problems that exist within the live-action show would always be problems, regardless of whether or not Katara had her hair loopies. Their absence would perhaps exacerbate the problems, and likewise, their presence doesn't eliminate the problems. So what are these problems I keep referring to? I should say off the bat that this isn't entirely a relentless bashing of the show. While I do despise it overall, like I suggested earlier, much of the physical production of the show is wonderful, and several of the performances are the equal of the ones in the original.
Hey, how was I supposed to know she was a Fire Nation soldier?
Very occasionally, moments in the show would actually surpass the cartoon. Those are worth pointing out, and I will, but for now, I have gripes, so I'm just gonna get out all of the random issues I have with this show that aren't really my main concern, but I still want to go off. Just indulge me for a few minutes. First off, the way that angry earthbender guy sarcastically pours water out in front of Iroh before chucking the water skin on the ground, then taking one bite out of an apple and throwing that away as well. Like, I know you're angry, but that's your stuff, my guy. Aren't they soldiers at war? Don't they have rations? And it looks so muddy there. Does he have to go and pick up the water skin later and go wash it off somewhere? This guy perplexes me. This reaction from Iroh is so funny. It completely undercuts the drama and horror of Zuko's burning. Everyone is so dry in this show, and they pick this one moment to act like an anime character. Bizarrely, cartoon Iroh was much more restrained in his reaction. Speaking of acting, the difference between the child actors and the adult actors is so stark. Bless him, Gordon Cormier looks the part and is so enthusiastic, but Noah Ringer looked the part as well. Neither are particularly good actors. And why is Ken Lung such a bad actor? I don't just mean here, I mean in general. It's at this point that I wish my video on Old hadn't got a copyright strike and needed to be taken down, because you'd see the history of my vendetta against him. I honestly really tried to get on board with this portrayal of Zhao. I do like the characterization of him as more of a preening, opportunistic idiot than his straightforwardly evil cartoon counterpart, but Lung delivers every line as if it's his first day he's ever spoken, and he's trying out whole new intonations out of curiosity, and it completely throws me off.
You won't mind if we take a look ourselves.
The firepower during Sozin's comet at the beginning is curiously weak. It's pretty much the same as normal firebending you see people pull off throughout the rest of the show, which has me wondering if they've thought ahead about this. And this. While we're on the invasion, for some reason they've made the show a lot darker than it was before. I don't mean in terms of content, there was so much death and mutilation in the cartoon. I mean in how graphic they were with the horrors of violence. Like, did we really need an extended shot of Gyatso screaming as he's burned alive while children cower behind him? Does that hit harder than just the single shot of his skeleton? I don't think so.
Because of the implication.
There are 4 or 5 separate instances of people being horrifically burned alive in the show, and the only one that's better for being there is Zuko's. I can absolutely see how actually witnessing the moment of his burning would help you sympathize with the character. I don't like how most of the focus is on Ozai's subjective experience of the moment, as opposed to, say, Iroh's, but best believe we'll get there later. It's just, there were 2 other much worse burnings all the way to death earlier in the show, so I'm honestly a bit jaded about the whole thing by this point. While the effects are as good as promised, if not better in most cases, and there are some wonderfully lavish sets throughout, there are also some tragic green screens that took me right out of the scene. And finally, this one tilt and pan. I just hate it. Alright, that's enough of the random gripes I needed to get off my chest. Let's get to the point. Flattening. So I can't stop thinking about this dialogue right here.
Look at the power you have. That's because of me.
That wasn't you. That was me.
I just can't get over those lines. It's like a teenager wrote it, or a first draft placeholder line you use to establish the idea you want to convey there, then go back later and make it more elegant, but they just forgot to do it. Or at least I did think that, until it turned out that that was the entire theme of the show's writing. Somehow the phrase show don't tell never ended up reaching the eyes and ears of those professional screenwriters, because they are obsessed with telling you about things that it would have been far more impactful to show. You get this crazy ham-fisted couple of lines at Lu Ten's funeral.
Is it true he abandoned the siege?
Yes, after his son was killed.
So, his son dies a hero and he'll be forever known as a coward.
It's incredibly clunky, partly because of the wording itself, like it's not something anyone would actually say while in earshot at a funeral, but also the fact that this is how we delivered this information, as opposed to it being implied through Iroh's interaction with other Fire Nation soldiers or people at the funeral. We never see anyone else revering Lu Ten or disrespecting Iroh for abandoning Ba Sing Se, so its impact is minimal. I'm still not sure it's as bad as this though.
Your failure in the 100-day siege of Ba Sing Se won't be held against you. Your son died in that siege, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
Again, I offer my condolences on your nephew burning to death in that terrible accident.
It's such a shame because the interaction between Iroh and Zuko later that very scene is fantastic. Zuko recognizes how hollow the nationalistic platitudes he's been trained to say are, so he opens up to Iroh about a time Lu Ten's kindness helped him, and sits by his side. In isolation, the bit when the tear falls down Iroh's face with the piano version of Leaves from the Vine playing in the background, fuck me, I might have cried if I wasn't so numb from the rest of it all. Another one that got me all vexed was Sokka's ice dodging trial. First of all, there's the fact that he even had an ice dodging trial back when the tribe was all together, which was a big sticking point for Sokka in the cartoon, given his obsessive desire to be the man of the house and a real water tribe warrior. I get where they're going with it. He overheard that he hadn't earned the win by his own skill, so he's going to get a redo later on, either to show how much he's grown on his journey, or to prove Barto's words correct, that he demonstrated true leadership by having friends like Aang and Katara help him pass the trials. Except we never actually see Sokka's initial trial. We just hear Hakoda and Barto describing what happened. Yeah, budgets are a thing, but to be frank, you could cut down the fight scenes in the prologue, either the Earthbender one or the attack on the Air Temple, and be better off devoting the time and resources to a life-defining moment of one of the main characters, rather than pew pew bam bam. The scene has the added drama of Sokka overhearing the conversation and how disappointed his father is, but it doesn't hit as hard as it could because we never actually got to see how Sokka acted in that moment, how he performed under pressure. We don't know if he hesitated or panicked, or whether he even knew that he'd fucked up at the time, because it probably wasn't anything internal that he could work on. For this Sokka, everything is just a skill issue, but we'll get onto more of that later. Show Don't Tell is a useful piece of guidance for writers, but it's not very nuanced. Talking is the primary way that we exchange information in the real world after all. I love me a good talkie scene. It just takes a bit of effort to make that act of talking compelling. What I'm not a big fan of is wasting words, which may be a surprise to some of you either familiar with this channel or looking at the timestamp right now. Listen, I'm a late millennial. I'm telling you, this is the absolute shortest amount of time I could talk about Avatar for. There's just so much dialogue in this show. Characters go on for minutes at a time, when literally one or two lines, or even none at all, could achieve the same effect. Sorry, I need to stop using modals like could or might. It did. The animated show fucking did this. The episode Masks is the absolute worst for it. This moment right here between Aang and Zuko, I think they actually do it better in the live action show. Almost everything is exactly the same as the cartoon, but they put Zuko on a boat, so when he launches his fireball at Aang and he deflects it with a blast of air, the backblast pushes Zuko away. That's brilliant. A great visual metaphor for their relationship and Zuko and Aang's differing outlooks. It's a shame then that they had 5 more minutes of chit-chat before that, where they spell out each of their motivations in explicit, detailed language. It can't be for the audience. We certainly don't need more dialogue explaining that Zuko is motivated by external expectations and Aang is scared of them. They couldn't stop saying it out loud.
I don't want the responsibility. I'm scared of my power. I'm scared of being alone.
Why did we need it spelled out that they don't have any intrinsic desire to fight the other when they kept the dialogue from the original scene that does it better?
If we knew each other back then, do you think we could have been friends?
Is it to endear them to one another? I'd argue that working in synergy and saving the other's life multiple times during the escape does that trick better. The added scene ends in pretty much the exact same way as the original too. Zuko launches a fireball at Aang and he deflects it. It robs the later moment of its impact, because Zuko's sudden violence in the face of Aang's kindness isn't shocking. He just tried it earlier.
It fooled me, we can't get fooled again.
The episode is bookended by this rambling, barely coherent narration from Iroh. And you know what? Fuck you. I'm going to play the whole thing in full, so you have to feel the full weight of his speech.
It's amazing how far we'll go to hide our true selves from the world. Perhaps it's because we don't want people to know how much they really mean to us. Which is funny, because the truth is, we would do anything for them. We'd travel incredible distances, risk our lives, even fight monsters. But I suppose it can be scary to admit you need people. Some might see that as a weakness, a liability. After all, what greater pain is there than losing someone you love? Or worse, finding out someone you love has left you behind. I guess that's why we feel the need to hide away and protect ourselves. So we put on a mask. It's not hard to understand why. What's hard is knowing that sometimes the mask is who we really are.
First of all, that was so many words. Too many words. If it takes you that long to say, we wear masks to protect ourselves from hurt, you're a shit writer. If you were padding to fill the scene, you didn't need to. Zuko's actor, Dallas Yu, is really pulling it off in these scenes. In fact, he's great all round. At first I was put off because he's trying way too hard and it's a bit awkward. But then I remembered, oh yeah, duh, this is Zuko. He's a self-consciously try-hard bad boy. Dallas Yu slaps in this role, and if you watch this montage without the voiceover, everything it says still comes across. Just let the montage, the music, the performances speak for themselves. And second, it doesn't really read in the voice of wise, mournful Uncle Iroh. It sounds more like a YA protagonist or a Meredith Grey voiceover. And it even has the same Grey's Anatomy way of desperately struggling to pull a bunch of disparate plot threads together like Spider-Man on any mode of transport. Like, does Aang wear a mask in this show? I thought that kid wore all his emotions on his sleeve, to the point of nearly being incapable of deception. Is it saying that as a result of losing Gyatso and temporarily losing the rest of Team Avatar, he starts putting up walls? I guess you could see him trying to keep Katara from fighting and merging with the water spirit as him doing that, but it still feels stretchy to me. Is that fair to say? Speaking of Aang, the show devotes a huge amount of time at the outset to Aang's pre-iceberg life. You'd think that with that time, they could find a way to show you Aang's character via decisions he makes or his interactions with other characters. But no, the show would rather just monologue to you about who Aang is. You get Gyatso telling him how wonderful and special he is, first in real life and then in a flashback.
But you're not just anyone, Aang. You're strong and kind and generous.
I hate when stories have a character do something to reveal their heroism and make me organically like them, like a Save the Cat moment. I much prefer it when shows tell me, this is the main character. He is good and strong and nice and brave. Like him. Probably the first moment that made me fully question if the show's writers were even good was Aang's absurdly lengthy monologue about how he feels to Appa. And you know what? Fuck you, we're playing the whole thing again.
Gyatso says I'm supposed to be the Avatar. Hey, Longstone even trusts me to feed the baby bison and I'm supposed to save the world? He said, I need to remember who I am. But I know who I am. I like to play airball and eat banana cakes and goof off with my friends. That's who I am. Not someone who can stop the Fire Nation. Not someone who can stop a war. The other kids always say I'm lucky because of the things I can do. But I trade places with any of them. I don't want to leave. I don't want the responsibility. I'm scared of my power. I'm scared of being alone. I'm scared.
I'm not kidding. This is dialogue on the level of the Star Wars prequels.
Anakin, you're breaking my heart.
You know what? Let's break this fucking soliloquy down and see whether this information could be gleaned through actions instead, via the cunning use of clips from the original show.
I like to play airball and eat banana cakes and goof off with my friends. The other kids always say I'm lucky because of the things I can do. But I trade places with any of them. I don't want to leave. I don't want the responsibility. I'm scared of my power. I'm scared of being alone.
This sequence's equivalent in the cartoon does contain one or two lines that sound just like this.
I was afraid and confused.
But the difference is, this is a confession. Aang has kept the circumstances that led to his being frozen in the iceberg a secret for 11 episodes by this point, until this fisherman accuses him of turning his back on the world, and Katara defends him, not knowing the full story, which makes him feel guilty. He's explaining his reasons for running away to Katara, someone he respects too much to continue lying to. He's not explaining it to the invisible audience. All in all, it doesn't matter how good or bad the performances are, the dialogue still lacks any nuance or subtlety, so it falls flat. Beyond individual lines, the macro storytelling decisions in the show leave a lot to be desired. The live-action show's story is told mostly in chronological order now, opening with Sozin planning the invasion, Aang finding out he's the Avatar, and the attack on the air nomads, before moving on to the main plot in the Southern Water Tribe. I'm fairly certain the only reason the opening Earthbender fight exists is to assure the audience that the bending won't look like absolute shite this time. The damage this one shot did to the hearts and minds of Avatar fans is incalculable. It's good we can laugh about it now though. While the whole thing is definitely a tone setter and some nice visual spectacle to get everyone immediately engaged, I think something is lost by telling the story this way. The cartoon left a lot of things a mystery in the first few episodes. Why did the Avatar disappear? How did Aang end up in the ice? Why isn't he jumping into the fight now that he's awake again? How did Zuko get that burn? What led to him needing to hunt down the Avatar so badly? Some of those questions aren't answered right away, which gives you a compelling reason to keep watching. And vitally, there's a very good reason that that information is withheld from you. None of the characters want to talk about it. The Avatar disappeared and the last 100 years of war happened because Aang freaked out and ran away before getting caught in the storm. Zuko was given his scar by his own father for disrespecting him, and he needs to find the Avatar to end his banishment. It's the greatest shame that each of them carries. Neither of these characters would be happily giving up that kind of information to people around them, which gives them some added depth and heightens the drama of the later reveals. I'm not proposing some kind of avant Nolan, timey-wimey, non-linear storytelling method here. It's just selectively revealing certain pieces of information to the audience to maximize their impact, and help you empathize with the characters that are likewise finding out this information. In fairness to it, the live-action show still keeps Zuko's origins a mystery at first, and if you absolutely had to lose the storm, tying the reveal into the Blue Spirit episode makes perfect sense. But all those questions about Aang are abandoned in favor of flatly charting all of his major life events in chronological order. Presumably this is so that the audience builds up main character attachment to Aang specifically, and follow him as their point of view character. But the result is that you have zero curiosity about Aang as a person. Katara, Sokka, and all the rest of the village are wondering who Aang is and how he got there, but the audience isn't, so it's just dragging the story down to dwell on their questions. Similarly, seeing Gyatso explicitly get air-fried by Sozin in the opening means that there's very little shock in finding his skeleton later. Listen, I don't think anyone was ever under any illusions that all the airbenders would just be chilling at the temple. Common sense would tell you that Gyatso would be dead after 100 years anyway, and they'd foreshadowed it all fairly thoroughly beforehand. I mean, what's the name of the show?
Uh-oh, John.
But receiving confirmation that a genocide occurred, and in such a brutal way no less, is the first real what the fuck moment the show has. If the tone for the first bunch of episodes has been all plucky kids fighting off silly bad guys and going on fun adventures, then it's jarring to suddenly see a corpse. In the live action show, you know exactly what happened to the airbenders because you watched it all go down. The only tension and drama you can get from the scene is wondering when Aang is going to figure it all out, and how he'll react when he does. And even that, the cartoon did better, with Katara and Sokka initially trying to convince Aang that the airbenders are all gone, then covering up evidence of the Fire Nation in a futile attempt to protect him from the truth after they realize how much it will devastate him. In this show, Sokka just picks up the helmet in full view of Aang, in the middle of a scorched courtyard. While I'm generally a fan of the way Zuko's flashbacks were handled, apart from the fact that he actually decided to fight Ozai and seemed to be able to get a hit in, like what the fuck, I do think his story is lessened somewhat by separating his and Aang's backstories. Now that Montage and the Kuleshov effect aren't doing all the heavy lifting of paralleling their two stories, the writers have to find other means to connect the two, which is the kind of decision that leads to all that extra dialogue in masks. I also have mixed feelings about the condensed plot lines in the show. Jet and the Mechanist stories have been folded into an expanded Omashu plot, along with some parts of Season 2, including the Cave of Two Lovers and Omashu's defeat, and Azula is here full stop. It's certainly more efficient if that was your focus, say if you're limited to a certain runtime or budget and want to get all the hits out there. It also makes the world feel a lot more connected, and in my opinion, having Jet come into conflict with the Mechanist over the former's absolutist stance on opposing the Fire Nation is a great move, but that comes at the cost of some of the nuance present in each of those characters' dedicated episodes. Moving the Mechanist out of the Northern Air Temple means that Aang isn't forced to accept progress, except that making a memorial out of the air nomads doesn't help the people currently living. Sokka barely gets to interact with Jet at all because he needs to be working with the Mechanist at the same time, so he doesn't get the chance to demonstrate his empathy for civilians regardless of their nation. Even the pacing within the show on its own terms is a bit off as a result of this condensed structure. That confrontation between Katara and Jet where they say the dumb lines, that occurs at the start of the episode, and it's the last time we see Jet. It's framed like the big conclusion of an episode arc for Katara, but it occurs at the start of an episode, disjointed from the events of the previous episode that it's paying off. Basically, they're relying on you binging the show here, or at least watching it in 2-episode chunks. Some episodes were completely cut, and honestly, while I could make a case for keeping imprisoned, I am 100% fine with losing the waterbending scroll, the Great Divide, and the Fortune Teller. There are some very fillery show of the week kind of episodes in the original that don't have much to do with the main plot and really aren't quite as entertaining as the rest. Having Gram Gram give Katara the waterbending scroll is arguably more of an emotional beat than nicking it from from some pirates, although it does result in some other losses we'll get to later. Spirited Away and Masks are probably the best example of the condensing working. Just like with Jet and the Mechanist, involving such a cool character as June in more of the core plot is never going to be a bad thing in my mind, and pulling the encounter with Ko forward, as well as changing his gimmick, gives Sokka and Katara something to do while the Blue Spirit shenanigans are going on. But other cut episodes are quite damaging to the quality of the show in my opinion, both in the long term and the short term. Bato of the Water Tribe and the Deserter are the site of some fantastic development for Team Avatar, and we'll get into how their absence is a huge loss for the characters later on. I know I keep saying that, but so many of the issues here are holistic, it's hard to separate one thing from another. But practically speaking, that likely means no Zhang Zhang in the rest of the show, and they have no idea that Hakoda's alive. These are all encounters that flesh out the world of Avatar, and plant seeds that grow into some great moments later down the line. Rather than taking this winding, bumpy route through the world, where they visit a dozen new places and meet a variety of characters, instead the gang visit Kyoshi Island, Omashu, that one village, and the Northern Water Tribe. It doesn't kill the show, it just diminishes it. It flattens it. Narratively speaking, an almost universal characteristic of a protagonist is that they undergo change. Don't worry, I'm not going to do the whole YouTuber thing where we patronizingly outline the hero's journey. I'd be frankly amazed you managed to get to this video on this day and age on YouTube without ever coming across it. Let's just say protagonists almost always change. Luke Skywalker starts out as an excitable, naive farm boy, itching to get out and see the world, and ends his trilogy as a thoughtful, reserved Jedi Knight. There are outliers, of course, like Lu and Nightcrawler, but these are characters written to be alienated from the viewer. They actually prove the rule through their defiance of it. A common change is for a character to overcome some kind of flaw or personal hang-up. Part of Luke's growth as a character is suffering the consequences of recklessness and arrogance, as well as the turmoil of finding out Vader is his father. He learns patience and mindfulness, and develops empathy for those he previously thought of as unredeemable monsters. Again, the slightly sick feeling you get when Lu fails to become a better person is what happens when you go against the grain here. In the Avatar cartoon, the characters went through dramatic changes over the course of the show. Not only do you have Sokka's arc, which I covered in the opening, but Aang similarly matures, staying a goofball all the way through to the end, but gradually embracing the responsibility he has as the Avatar. Katara's arguably the most static of the characters, and even she has arcs in several episodes where she has to learn lessons about herself. This is why it's particularly confusing that Sokka doesn't start out sexist in the live-action show. Absent that particular flaw, he doesn't have any emotional journey to go on. He starts out pretty great and ends up pretty great. Staying static like this not only makes Sokka more boring, but it also makes him harder to relate to. More than that, it diminishes his relationship with his father. In the cartoon, Hakoda and the other men leave the tribe when Sokka is much younger, and his sexism stems mostly from trying to embody the heroic masculine traits that he idealized in his father, fueled by his last words.
Being a man is knowing where you're needed the most. And for you right now, that's here protecting your sister.
It instills in him this idea that people have strict roles and responsibilities in society, and that the role of protector is tied to him being a man. The tragedy is that Hakoda was just trying to comfort his young son, to give him some guidance and direction, given he won't be there to teach him for years, or potentially ever. So he offers him a brief set of instructions on how to be a good man that Sokka completely misreads because he's a baby. They keep Sokka's hang-ups about his father in the live-action show, along with how that resulted in how seriously he takes the job of protecting his tribe. They even expanded into the flashback about the ice dodging trial, where we find out that he's haunted by his failure to live up to his father's standards. But that never results in an insecurity that hurts the other characters, or even damages Sokka in any way. Internalizing that he's not good enough for his father only ever comes out in his criticisms of Katara for being naively optimistic, which aren't even presented as being flaws. She did make friends with a terrorist after all. All it does to him personally is motivate him to try and become a better fighter in a really calm and even-tempered way, which just feels wrong to me, especially when you compare Sokka to Zuko's similar issues with his father. Adding in the ice dodging trial scene unites the two in failing to live up to the standards set by their fathers. The only difference is that Hakoda is a nice guy and lies to Sokka about how well he did, and Ozai is a dick, so he banishes Zuko. But that makes Zuko into a horrible little baby, while Sokka is just fine. It makes the whole encounter on Kyoshi Island feel so lackluster. Sokka's whole reason to be there isn't to learn humility and respect. His actual problem is that he's not very good at things. He's a natural on the maracas, but he fucks up his ice dodging trial and he loses to Zuko. Even if he wasn't sexist, you could still make the Kyoshi plot work for Sokka, and they get so close to doing it. When Suki appears interested to hear that he's the protector of his village, I was so certain that he was going to lie and inflate his skills as a warrior, leading to a humiliating public defeat by Suki in a sparring match, where he learns that he should admit his shortcomings and learn from his betters. But no, he just confesses that he hasn't had much experience, and is delighted when Suki offers to train him. He's not even really bragging when he talks about being his village's protector. It sounds more like he's genuinely trying to relate to her. If anything, Suki is painted as the one showing off, as she initiates the fight and feels the need to one-up him in everything. So there's no issue with his beliefs or personality, it's just a skill issue. I can't tell you how uncompelling that is to me. You could say that they're pushing Sokka down the path of realizing he doesn't need to be a hand-to-hand fighter to help his tribe through his interactions with the Mechanist, but in that case, what's the point of him learning how to fight from Suki, or painting that whole experience as a positive one? Is it just to establish Suki as a romantic interest for Sokka, or is it in service of Suki's story about opposing isolationism? Feels like the wrong move to put all the character development on the side characters at the cost of the main ones. You can have both, again the cartoon did it, but if you have to pick, I'd say pick the main. Katara also suffers from this excising of her more negative traits. An issue she has to overcome in the cartoon is her jealousy of Aang's natural bending ability. As the only remaining waterbender in her tribe, she struggles so much, taking baby steps as she figures it out all on her own. Then comes Aang, and he does things in seconds that she took months to learn. Her insecurity about her bending ability even leads her to steal, putting the gang in danger. But she overcomes her competitive nature and focuses on herself, and in the end she becomes a much better waterbender than Aang as a result of her practice and dedication. In the live action show, he shows up, tells her to be one with the Force, and she figures it all out. I don't even think she tries to teach Aang waterbending, which is pretty wild. I don't need this particular storyline to exist in the show, but Katara has nothing else to work on. She's never unkind to anyone, she's not bossy or domineering, and it's not even like witnessing the brutal death of her mother left her with any violent, irrational hatred. Her only problem is she needs someone to teach her waterbending. It's just a skill issue. Except no, she doesn't even need a teacher. Aang gives her like 2 nuggets of wisdom and everything else she gets from the waterbending scroll. It turns out you don't need a teacher to figure out this ancient art. You just need a book and to think about it for a second.
Well, have fun teaching yourself. I'm sure you'll do a great job.
Yeah, she fucking did. Everyone's calling her a master by the end of the show, and she's presumably only been doing this for a few months.
You found a master, haven't you?
Yes. You're looking at her.
Which makes it fucked that Aang doesn't properly waterbend in the show, given how naturally attuned he is to the elements. There's not even any back and forth between her and Zuko as the sun and moon rise respectively, which serves as a small-scale version of the moon shenanigans later and the daily pace of the war. Katara is perfect, so she can't lose, which means they just end on a stalemate when the moon is killed and a fireball destroys the building. What they do keep in is the whole Northern Water Tribe sexism subplot, where Paku refuses to train Katara because she's a girl. Keeping this in shows that it's not the entire presence of sexism amongst the good guys that the showrunners objected to. It's specifically sexism in the main characters. No one in Team Avatar has inner flaws to overcome. They mostly just forget that they're already awesome and need to be reminded of that on occasion. The first questionable moment of these was when Aang finds Gyatso's corpse and goes into the Avatar state, destroying his surroundings and risking hurting Sokka and Katara. In the cartoon, he's gearing up to go nuclear when Katara actively decides to try and talk him down. She relates to him over their shared pain of loss and reminds him that even though the airbenders are gone, he still has Sokka and Katara. They've already resolved to journey with him and keep him safe, but this is the moment they truly become a family. Aang descends, calms down, and apologizes before collapsing. In the live-action version, he thinks about Gyatso and that time he went on about how awesome Aang is, and remembers that he'll always carry Gyatso's love with him. You know,
what is beef if not cow persevering?
Then he just calms down and descends and breaks down in Katara's arms. He also doesn't apologize for nearly killing them. So that's it, he can get himself out of the Avatar state. They spend a lot of the rest of the show going, "Oh, that Avatar state sure is dangerous. You need to learn how to master it or you could hurt someone, Aang." But all of that falls flat for me because he already did. He mastered himself in probably the most extreme circumstance he'll find himself in for a good long while, and stopped himself from hurting anyone. He didn't need outside help. It was his memory of Gyatso that kept him grounded, which he'll always have. Aang's lack of control over the devastating power he wields is a big sticking point in the cartoon. So much that there's an entire episode devoted to someone trying to help him control it, which goes terribly. In the season finales, he makes conscious decisions to enter the Avatar state, with varying degrees of success, but every other time is prompted by a loss. Finding Gyatso's skeleton, nearly losing Katara and Sokka in the storm, Zhao killing the moon spirit, thinking Katara had been killed by the Earthbender, finding out Appa was stolen. And when he loses control in that state, the only thing that brings him back is the intervention of an external force. One time it was Roku, but usually it's Katara. That through line, that Katara can always bring him back from the edge, is a powerful one, and I don't think the memory of Gyatso is a better replacement for it. Would this moment, when Appa's stolen and Aang flies off the handle, be better with Aang taking the time to have a good think about Gyatso and how much he'd want him to be kind? Or with Katara grabbing his arm and looking at him with this empathetic expression, clinging onto him until he finally stops and cries in her arms? The cartoon used these moments to reinforce his fear of this power. He always apologizes for nearly hurting people, seemingly shocked by the destruction he causes in this state.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry I got so mad. I'm sorry, Katara.
And just like when he messes up firebending, he resolves never to use it.
I hope you never have to see me like that again.
In the live-action show, he doesn't even seem to be particularly worried about the fact that he nearly killed his only two friends in the world. Katara's dialogue to comfort Aang is changed from reassurance that he's not alone to reassurance that loss makes you stronger, which I never like in anything. You can't say that in a show where Zuko exists. They do have Katara talk Aang down from the edge in the live-action show, but it's been moved to the end, when he merges with the water spirit. The whole scene is reframed around Aang surrendering his body to the spirit as the ultimate sacrifice to save the world, and when the moon is restored, Katara manages to talk him down with a version of the speech she gives him in the cartoon. I think that's pretty great, and in fact both live-action adaptations made the right call in giving Aang a personal reason to go apeshit in the north, and I like that there's some trade-off for Aang in becoming the koi monster. But I also think that it's less impactful having the point where Aang needs to be reached by Katara occur when he makes a cold, conscious choice to give up than when he's blinded by grief and rage. By this point in the story, he's fully accepted being the Avatar. Now he's just trying to figure out how to do it properly. His journey with the Avatar state isn't synonymous with his reluctance to accept responsibility or his immaturity when wielding power anymore. He just needs someone to teach him how to turn it on and off. Like Sokka, it's just a skill issue. But the strangest instance of smoothing out a character's negative traits for me is that Aang didn't run away. The show certainly acts like he did, and I honestly have no idea whether this is a me problem. Aang originally doesn't seem to feel any guilt about the state the world is in at the start of the show, but by the end of it, he's apologizing to people for abandoning them, and I just get the sense that he was gaslit by everyone into misremembering what actually happened. What actually happens is Aang monologues to Appa, says that he needs to go flying to think, and then when the storm starts getting really bad, he says to Appa that they should go back. As far as we see, the kid never meant to run away, and so far everything we've been told about him is that he's perfect and special and can do no wrong. So no wonder he doesn't feel any guilt about disappearing for 100 years. It was a total accident. People even absolve him of any lingering sentiment he might have by pointing out that if he'd been there, he would have been killed, which, maybe, I'm not too sure about that. Like we went over earlier, Aang's main arc as a character is that he needs to overcome his fear and accept the responsibility of being the Avatar. In order for that to work, he needs to have actually run away from that responsibility before. But at the end of the first episode of the show, he's fully gung-ho to be the Avatar and making a beeline for people who'll guide him in what that means. What that's replaced with is disagreements about what it means to be the Avatar, and Aang and the crew usually win those disagreements. Every one of the Avatars, along with Bumi, tell him that friends and attachments are a bad idea and he has to do this on his own. The constant pushback is that friends are great and everyone should embrace their inner child. The wrap-up statement of the show on Aang's character arc is that he needs to stop living in the past and look forward to the future, but I don't think that matches up with the rest of the text. The only thing in the past he keeps coming back to is Gyatso, but he moved on from that in Masks. Besides that, he's very forward-thinking, actively trying to come up with how to help the world, rather than living in this fantasy that he's he's just a little kid who can afford to goof around and put off helping put the world to rights. That's cartoon Aang. The effect that does have is that everyone who has a go at him for leaving the world to suffer for a century is wrong. They have no leg to stand on, which makes them seem like assholes. And Aang is a far more boring character because he has nothing to come to terms with about himself and work on. In fact, Aang never messes up in general. Here's a brief list of some fucked up things that Aang does in the cartoon's first season. Running away from the air temple in the middle of the night, setting off the booby trap in the Fire Nation ship, putting the village in danger, lying to Sokka and Katara about being the Avatar, nearly killing the two of them in the Avatar state, spending all of his time fucking around trying to ride the Unagi and whatnot instead of saving the world, keeping the location of Sokka and Katara's dad from them, and burning Katara's hands with firebending. None of these things are present in the live-action show, and along with them go all the character growth. Aang doesn't need to learn self-control, he's already right on track from the get-go. I would say they haven't replaced it with other mistakes to tell a different but equally compelling story, but they did. Aang's new problem is that he's forgotten that he's actually the best, and he needs to remember and accept that. That valorizing of Aang ripples out to other characters as well. If Aang doesn't do anything to wrong Sokka and Katara, it's not a particularly difficult decision for them to stay with him, like the choice between Aang and their father in the Bato episode. After their introduction, there's never a point where their friendship is tested, and they reconfirm their dedication to each other. They're just perfect to each other to the very end. It's not just negative traits that get excised, it's anything that could rock the boat between the three mains after their initial encounter. Aang doesn't seem to have much of a crush on Katara for one. Not only does that mean that if they want to end the show the same way, they're gonna have to make Aang suddenly start to express feelings for Katara, which could be weird. But without the Cave of Two Lovers, there's not really much chance for Katara to reciprocate those feelings either. Aang trying to impress Katara was a pretty common motivator for a lot of his actions, and led to him making a number of childish, insecure decisions that put himself and the team at risk on more than one occasion. Part of his Avatar journey is accepting that he may have to sacrifice his personal wants like love for his duty to the world, which the live-action show definitely grappled with. Self-sacrifice is pretty much the only part of being the Avatar that his predecessors tried to teach him, but removing the additional context of his romantic love for Katara, I'm gonna be real, it's just more boring. There's less opportunity for drama, and it makes him less of a relatable character to people who've also dealt with unreciprocated love. You can see the same thing happen with Sokka and Yue, and listen, I'm not of the opinion that their romance is particularly interesting in the original, but they somehow make it even less interesting in the live-action show. She's no longer engaged to that one nitwit, she just broke it off independently off screen, which kinda sabotages the whole defying tradition subplot of the North. And worse, everybody is okay with that. Sokka and the other guy get along just fine, communicating openly with one another on the subject, and supporting Yue in their own ways, which is lovely and ideal, but have you ever met a teenager? Besides, this way, there's no tension, no back and forth. It just happens and it ends. Just like Suki, it's flat. In a more literal sense, the characters are flattened by being less extreme than their cartoon counterparts. The most obvious changes concern Ozai and Azula, and on the whole, I like the changes. In theory, both characters take a much more active role in the events of the first season and are humanized far more than they ever were in the cartoon, which I think is a smart thing to do. Naturally, the show spells it out a bit too much, but I like that it's there rather than not. In the cartoon, Azula does get some very revealing backstory throughout Book 3, and ultimately becomes one of the most tragic figures of the story, culminating in a complete mental breakdown in the conclusion, through a combination of numerous betrayals leading to paranoia, the lingering trauma of her mother's death, and her desperate desire for Ozai's love. But she spent almost all of Season 2 confined to the role of Zuko's psycho sister who shoots blue fire. It was cool as all hell, and it was shallow. Introducing her character earlier, and actually showing us Ozai's manipulations up front, will make us hate the guy more, and will probably make Azula's later interactions with Zuko all the more compelling. But I said that these expansions are better in theory, because the result was kinda boring to me. And this is one of those instances where I don't know if I'm just blindly preferring the cartoon because it's the original, but I do have my reasons. Take Ozai. In the cartoon, we only saw him through Zuko's flashbacks and Aang's imagination, and he was depicted in line with those two's perspective of him. He was just a silhouette for the majority of the show, a looming specter of oppression. To Aang, he was a force of nature, an impossible threat, and the greatest realization of his duty as the Avatar. That is until he reaffirms his belief that all life is sacred, and he strips Ozai of his bending, literally and metaphorically diminishing him. To Zuko, unable to understand how a father could maim and banish his son, he was a terrifying and indomitable figure, until he finally confronts Ozai, reducing him from a myth to what he always was, just a man and an abuser, and we see him in full. That ends up being a through line of the show, the realization of all the monstrous villains of the show as just people. Everyone is trying to get Aang to murder them, but he refuses to take a life, refuses to accept that people are beyond saving. Azula's self-conscious need to be perfect and seen as the best stemmed from a deep anxiety brought on by her father, and Ozai's cruelty and ethno-superiority is the product of generations of indoctrination. It's quite profound and a mark of Aang's heroism that he chooses to see everyone as a person rather than a monster, and the show instills the same belief on the audience. In the live-action show, Ozai is an absolute bastard. Besides, continuing the war and setting all those people on fire, he gaslights and manipulates his children into competing for his love and burns half of Zuko's face to teach him a lesson. But bizarrely, Daniel Dae Kim's performance is too nuanced. It clearly hurts him to injure Zuko, and he still goes and gives Zuko a second chance by coming to his room and explaining the lesson he was trying to teach him. Having Zuko stand up to him here, and even after being burned, standing by his belief in compassion, it diminishes them both. It makes Ozai look comparatively less cruel by being less harsh with Zuko, and it diminishes Zuko's arc of realizing he doesn't need his father's approval because he's already openly disagreeing with him. On a slightly unrelated note, I don't really get why Azula doesn't have blue fire as her default in the show. Presumably they're saving that as an indication of when she goes Super Saiyan, but I never understood it to be an indication of raw strength, rather a unique trait of Azula's firebending. Like Ozai and Zuko's fire didn't turn blue when they hit peak strength under Sozin's comet. Taking it away from her character at this stage is just another thing that makes her a bit less interesting to watch. Beyond those two, Mei and Ty Lee were previously complete opposites, being a deadpan, knife-throwing semi-sadist and a hypermanic chi-blocking gymnast respectively. It doesn't make them one-note characters. They both have hidden depths, form meaningful relationships with other characters throughout, and equally meaningfully break them. In the Netflix show, they're basically the same person. Their only difference is that Ty Lee smiles when she delivers her lines, while Mei stays neutral. I don't actually think they move once throughout the show. They're just rooted to their marks, which would be okay for Mei, but I didn't think it was even possible for Ty Lee to stay still. Part of this toning down doubtless comes from the move to live action. It'd be much harder, almost impossible even, to tell the kind of story the showrunners are trying to tell with Ozai and his family, with the former silhouetted throughout every scene. It'd be goofy and boring having these extended scenes of dialogue with a static shadow. You might shrug at this and say, of course, that's always going to happen in this kind of adaptation. Unconstrained by practical limitations, animation allows for far more exaggeration in characters, in both their physicality and voice performance, and suspension of disbelief on the audience part is far greater. To emulate animation style in live action tends to slip straight into the uncanny valley, to which I would say, don't make a cartoon known for its pure unmedicated ADHD characters into live action then. The Spider-Verse films are better than every live action Spider-Man movie. Yeah, that's right, go ahead and leave your fucking comment about Spider-Man 2. You only fuel me with engagement. Live action adaptations of comics and cartoons aren't intrinsically bad. It's just that when you constrain something like that to real world physics, the tone becomes similarly more grounded, grey, and muted. I think live action is the perfect choice for films like Winter Soldier and Civil War, because the tone is matched by the medium it's being delivered through. Likewise, I could definitely see live action working for some other murkier time period in the Avatar universe, like a Roku and Sozin story, or a Kyoshi story. Hell, Korra would probably work great in live action. But this is the story of a bunch of kids romping across the world, with the main character a whimsical Peter Pan who gradually accepts the seriousness of their quest in time, but in the meantime, he's gonna go penguin sledding, goddammit. The effect that has is in reducing the most distinctive fringe characters to seeming just a bit weird. Sometimes that's less to do with the performance and more down to framing, like losing the huge zooms and musical stabs the cartoon was able to easily get away with. That results in one of the funniest and most iconic parts of the whole show here.
Yeah, I forget the next couple lines, but then it goes, Secret Tunnel!
Instead hitting with all the humor and enthusiasm of a depressed blobfish in the live action show. Although it's hard to say that that's a live action problem when the crash zoom, exists. Without that more exaggerated framing, Bumi's insanity comes across as more awkward than anything. But you'd still have that issue no matter how you filmed it. I honestly laughed out loud when Bumi stripped down, and this was meant to be the intimidating figure he was hiding underneath. It's still impressive for someone over 100 years old, but the oh fuck that comes from seeing the ridiculously ripped cartoon Bumi emerge doesn't translate to this more realistic version. Couldn't they have found someone more hench to play him? Or stuck Utkar Shambudkar in a huge muscle suit or something? If it's possible to bump Zachary Levi to Shazam levels, or make Dwayne Johnson look like he did in Central Intelligence, then it's possible to make someone else look like The Rock. But that reveal of Bumi is just the seasoning on the real meat of the issue. God, I'm so proud of myself for writing that line. No, the real issue is that none of the wise old mentors are particularly wise or good at mentoring. The White Lotus get absolutely murked by this show. Take Bumi. All of the challenges he gives Aang in the cartoon are to teach him a specific lesson. As Aang puts it,
I had to open my brain to the possibilities.
The challenge with the key teaches him not to rush headfirst into everything, and instead approach things from a different angle. The encounter with Flopsy teaches him not to judge a book by its cover. Even the final fight against him was to teach him not to underestimate anyone, especially the elderly, which the show fully proves to be sage wisdom. In the live-action show, they pay lip service to it with this one completely tensionless encounter.
A word of advice, the direct path is not always the best path.
It doesn't really come across to me like Bumi was fighting Aang out of any reason except revenge. The trolley problem he presents him with at the end feels more like an improv. Instead, it feels like Bumi is angry at Aang for abandoning him in the world, and wants to take out his resentment on him in a fight. Here's the thing, out of context, I like this particular scene. I think the lesson Bumi is trying to teach Aang is genuinely resonant, that the burden of wielding power is having to make sacrifices, to continuously make choices between one group and another. As the Avatar, he'll be faced with the hardest choices of all, and he needs to be prepared to make them. It's great setup for the arc in Book 3, where he debates the morality of killing Ozai with his friends in the previous Avatars. The trouble is, Bumi is wrong. I want to be clear here, I don't think it's a problem that Bumi's argument is wrong. Aang's value in the world is his mercy and his unwillingness to sacrifice his morals for the sake of practicality. His victory over Bumi here is a microcosm of his final decision to spare Ozai, although the method of relying on his friends to sort it out is fairly odd. Like, will the final showdown end with Sokka coming in to throw a fucking boomerang at the head of this fire god? It's arguably better that this question is raised earlier than later. My problem is that Bumi is wrong. We've seen these kinds of artificial trolley problems in film and TV many times before, but not from heroic characters. This is a classic supervillain move. Green Goblin, Joker, Riddler, Joker again, Doc Ock, Thanos, Flag Smashers, Thanos again, Ozymandias, Spider-Man 2099. There's a dozen examples and more of a kooky costume baddie saying, let this one person die to save another. Who are you gonna choose? Mwah. That's not to say that heroes don't often debate the relative morality of killing and sacrifice, but the difference between a hero and a villain in this scenario is the hero keeps it hypothetical until it's absolutely necessary to make the choice. They don't drop a rock on someone and go, quick, are you a moral absolutist or more of an act utilitarian? I neglected to talk about the hero's journey earlier, but one element I want to point out now is the often vital role of the mentor. They guide the protagonist on their journey, setting them off on the right path before usually tragically dying. Obi-Wan, Gandalf, Brom, any other grey-bearded wizard, mentor. Avatar is absolutely stacked with grey-bearded wizards. It even establishes a secret society out of them by the end, and they pretty much single-handedly end the war. Those wise mentors don't need to be perfect. Gandalf, for instance, is a massive stoner, so he keeps forgetting things, and he can be snippy on occasion, though that's justified because Pippin is a fucking moron. But the vast majority of the time, and especially when it's time to impart some wise words, he's kind, patient, and forgiving to all, even fools of Tooks. Likewise, Iroh in the cartoon wasn't this perfect being of infinite wisdom. He had a tendency to get distracted by hot food, hot tea, and hot women. But he had a tremendous amount of empathy for people who by all accounts should be his mortal enemies, and was fully devoted to helping Zuko actualize his best self. I think the live-action Iroh is mostly there, but he had to go and sass that one dumb earthbender after his monologue about how Iroh is responsible for his brother's death. This is someone he should have the utmost empathy for. They essentially had the same experience experience of loss in war, except it led the Earthbender down a path of hatred and led Iroh to enlightenment. But rather than offering some kind of condolences or apologies or nuggets of wisdom that might set the guy on a better path, he just goes, yeah, war made you into a real piece of shit, didn't it? He ultimately shows mercy and spares the man, which is solid Iroh, but he immediately gets stabbed in the back for it. I feel like that would have been a good time to teach Zuko the value of mercy, but if anything, it has the opposite effect.
That's what you get for showing an Earthbender compassion.
If you don't mind pulling things in from Book 2, why not lay some groundwork for Zuko's redemption? Losing some of Iroh's goofy fun is also harmful to the story in my opinion. Cartoon Iroh grew to see all life as precious after his son died in the war. He takes the time to enjoy the simple pleasures, and in doing so, he shows Zuko that he has room in his life for more than just hunting the Avatar. He has room for friendship, love, and community. In the live-action show, all his joviality is reframed as pretense to avoid expressing his grief and concern for Zuko.
Everything I need is on this boat. Like I said, all the tea I need.
That is an absolutely heart-wrenching scene, I agree. But couldn't he have also made some tea at some point? I think I saw him with tea like once throughout the whole show. This is another downside to losing Zhong Zhong from the story. Without him, we lose yet another opportunity for Aang to learn something. Imagine taking Yoda out of the story of Empire Strikes Back. Luke isn't cautioned against recklessness and impatience, he fast-tracks to cool swooshy Jedi tricks, and he doesn't fuck up so badly he learns the lesson the hard way. It's just Luke going off to rescue his friends, which he succeeds at without any loss because he and they are perfect. It seems to me like they took the single story of the gang coming in with fresh ideas and teaching Paku not to be sexist and made it the theme of every old man encounter. There's nothing for them to learn from those that came before. In fact, every one of the lessons they try to teach are rejected by the gang. The Avatar doesn't need to make difficult choices or face certain battles alone. Just believe in the power of friendship and everything will work out. The Avatars themselves are a whole other bag. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Avatars are meant to be at one with the universe, right? They embody balance and harmony amongst all things, and are the bridge between all peoples and all worlds. It involves a good deal of thoughtful meditation and sober reflection on the moral use of power. Their journey in mastering themselves and the elements of the world is long and arduous, but eventually every Avatar reaches enlightenment. So why the hell is Kyoshi such a dick? We're not talking about some kids in the middle of their paths here, still a bit rough around the edges and frankly having more trouble with puberty than manipulating the energies of the universe. This is a fully actualized Avatar who lived a whole life. More than a whole life. Kyoshi was over 200 years old when she died, and yet...
Run away from your responsibilities again, and even more will be hurt. Being the Avatar means putting your duties above all else, even your life.
That doesn't sound very at balance with the universe to me. I like that all the Avatars have unique qualities, partly dictated by their culture and partly by their individual personalities. I'm not sure I like that Roku is a bit of a jokester now, given his best friend kinda murdered him and his inaction led to 100 years of war and the genocide of the Airbenders, but hey ho, I like Goofy Iroh and that guy fucked up like most of his life, so I'm down with Kooky Roku. I'm also down with Kyoshi being more of a police brutality vibed Avatar, who has a policy of break the law and I drop you into a pit of lava. That's exactly what she was like in the cartoon. But I don't think that justifies her being so impatient and rude to Aang.
And how many have already been hurt because you haven't been here?
Once again, Aang didn't run away, and he's been trying his best to find out how to be the Avatar ever since the end of the first episode, which Kyoshi should know as an immortal spirit and also a pre-incarnation of Aang. Cartoon Kyoshi made mistakes of her own in life. She created the Dai Li, who end up being arguably the biggest threat of Book 2. She of all people should know better, and surely all of these wise mentors should know that this isn't the most effective way to convey their wisdom. But all the other Avatars are the same, snapping at Aang when he asks very basic questions I'd expect of a confused 12-year-old.
Anything you need.
It has to do with Ko.
Anything but that.
You don't understand.
No, you don't understand.
That's not possible.
Yes, it is. Kyoshi did it.
I'm not Kyoshi.
But you still could.
Kyoshi was an absolutist and believed in using her power to bring about justice by any means necessary, including killing. That's the belief of people like Ozai and Sozin, who were willing to sacrifice anyone and anything to achieve their goals, an attitude that led to this world being the way it is. Aang needs to disagree with her to be this world's hero, but tone is important, I think. The Kyoshi of the cartoon sounds like someone who's made peace with her values and the consequences of action and inaction.
But I assure you, I would have done whatever it took to stop Jin. I offer you this wisdom, Aang. Only justice will bring peace.
Her methods worked for her time, so those are the anecdotes she draws wisdom from. Live-action Kyoshi sounds like someone who's never questioned herself once in her life.
A mighty, merciless warrior.
Much like Bumi, she sounds like a villain. It was when I had this thought that it clicked for me. Why they kept certain things the same and made the changes they did. They're trying to appeal to Gen Z. Aang and the gang have emerged into this fucked up world where all the previous generations are either actively perpetuating systems of oppression or so jaded and hopeless that they're doing nothing but trying to stay afloat while the world gradually burns. The kids have got all this passion and will to right wrongs, but they've got no idea how to actually do anything about it. Just like the characters, it's a skill issue.
You had it harder than him.
Even the sympathetic side characters are teenagers chafing at the restrictions placed on them by their parents. From a certain point of view, that makes sense. It's certainly difficult, but in the past I've been able to rationally accept that the thing isn't bad simply because I'm not every target audience, that I don't have any right to claim authority over a piece of media simply because of my attachment to a version of it. I think stories should change and adapt, just as society should change and adapt. There's a great tradition dating back to the dawn of civilization, of telling and retelling stories, making changes and embellishments that speak to the truths we wish to express and impart on each other and our children, to inspire and to ask questions about the world we live in. But storytelling conventions aren't isolated to a particular time or generation. They're wrapped up in the essential human experience. The journey heroes go through mirrors our own journey through life, from childhood to adulthood, which is why we keep telling it over and over again, and have done for thousands of years. We'll always have internal struggles as long as we're human. We'll have to question our beliefs, admit our faults, and yes, struggle against the prejudices of those that came before, but to also struggle to know ourselves along the way. I think the showrunners fundamentally misunderstood the concept of a hero, and thought that it means someone who is always right, who leads the way and shows everyone how to live. They clearly weren't afraid to tackle topics like sexism, but only as external forces that the heroes need to defeat, never as an internalized issue. Their characters are aspirational, but they're not relatable. If heroism isn't a choice, if it doesn't take work to be better, how heroic can it really be? They took this story of Aang and the team going out into the world and growing up, asserting themselves when they see injustice, but learning from their own mistakes and the wisdom of those that came before, and they flattened it into the story of perfect Aang and his perfect friends going out into the world, teaching everyone else right and wrong through the power of hope and friendship. And you know what? It's funny. The cartoon characters feel more real. Thanks very much for watching. I hope my post-cold voice isn't too weird to listen to. I will admit, this one ran away from me a little bit, and it might have been a bit too rambling in places. I wasn't kidding when I was talking about my attachment to this show, and I hope that the points I was trying to make are actually valid and not the unstructured ranting of a butthurt fanboy. With that in mind, I'm quite curious to hear if other people share this sentiment or disagree with it, so sound off in the comments if you've got any thoughts on the subject. Or, you know, if you just want to rant about shitty Avatar adaptations. I absolutely won't hold you to the same standards I hold myself to, so feel free to go off on one. This is a safe space for you. Subscribe if you'd like to see more from me and the gang at UDS, and check out our sister channels UDS Gaming and UDS Music if you're an absolute slut for content. My name's Drew, and I'll see you in the next one.
Water dry.